Okay, we'll start now. Today's talk is titled Starving the Natives, Israel's Settler Colonial Mechanism and Function by Hanine Hassan. Hanine Hassan is a teaching fellow in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University in New York, where she is also completing her PhD. Hanine holds MA in Linguistics and MSc in Political Science. Her research interests include political theory and affect theory in the context of oppression and exploitation. She is the policy advisor for the Euromed for Human Rights in Gaza. Welcome, Hanine, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just haven't told me how long I have.
Like 25, 30 minutes would be fine.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming, and I hope everyone can hear me.
Just speak up a little bit. If you move closer.
شغل الميكروفون هنا.
Okay. Settle down.
So whenever someone is able to enter, it feels every single time as a small victory. So today I was asked to talk about my research topic, which is settler colonialism and putting Israel in that context. I think it's very important for people doing research on the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict to place it within a framework, to place the state of Israel within a framework of settler colonialism and not simply colonialism. When you look at it this way, you'll be able to actually figure out that the state of Israel, its creation and its mechanism, the way it implements the occupation is nothing new, and it has actually been used previously by other settler colonial nations such as the United States, Canada, Australia, any country that needs to bring a population from outside to colonize a country and remove the native population. And so today I will discuss this mechanism, and I will particularly look at the mode of starvation and how making the indigenous people hungry and just depriving them by creating certain bodies is actually a mechanism in order to control and gain more land. And every single mechanism that Israel is using has been used before that by the United States against the natives, by Canada against their own, the original, what we call the indigenous people, indigenous people, and Australia is doing the exact same thing. And so settler colonialism can provide us with a historical continuity rather than similarity between past and present stories of conquest. Settlers, regardless of the historical framework we engage with, were and are always seeking to appropriate land. It is only the means of this appropriation that change and develop with time. So if we look at the way Canada did it 200 years ago, it is not that much different than what Israel is doing today. It's just that we're looking at different mechanisms that can work in the 21st century. And so in their stories subjugating the indigenous population, settlers approach them with a logic of elimination and not exploitation, which is typical for a colonial approach. If you look at Britain in India or the British Empire, where it dealt with the Middle East, it was exploiting the resources. We go to a certain area, we look to a certain product that we need, we take it, but we do not move the population in a certain way. But settler colonialism is different. It's like we want the land without the people on it, and hence we have to develop mechanism in order to remove the people, and then not only gain the land, but then gain the resources. And these people, those that survive this mechanism, are used as a labor force for the new settler community that has come to the country. And so it's actually the entire time a settler, in order to, it's a mechanism, settler colonialism is a mechanism that needs to feed on something. And the things that it feeds on are an ever expanding frontier of settlement. It always pushes the borders that it has set for itself. So when it arrives and it wants a certain land, just as in Canada, they started with only wanting the west coast, and then the east coast, and then you see that they keep on pushing and pushing that boundary, because once you have settlers, their needs are bigger, and they grow as a population, and they grow with their demands and in their ways that they look at this land. And it's very similar to what Israel has been doing. And in this way, settler colonialism is a multi-layered process that involves the metropolitan officials. So you need a motherland, the people that send the settlers. It needs a colonial administrator, civil and military power. It needs the natives, and it also needs the new settler community. So it has a motherland that is sending these settlers. And then you have the military and the civil administration that needs to make this process function. In the case of Palestine, it's the Israeli bureaucracy and administrative organization. You also need a settler community that is willing to travel, and you need a motive that will push them to travel. And in this case, back in the days, it was in the name of Rome. So in the name of Christianity, you will have missionaries go and travel, and what will actually push them is that they need these new indigenous people to become Christian. They need their salvation. We need to save them from themselves. And this is what the tactic that used to be done. When Columbus arrived to America, it was in the name of the church. So you need something to push people, to push these, to leave their lives behind and come. Just as Israel is doing, using religion as the main motive. Well, we all know that it's other actually motives are at hand. When you put all these four actors in service of eliminating the natives and appropriating the land and resources, what you actually discover is a so-called new civilization that is being put on top of another civilization that is being eliminated. And that process is actually meant to be permanent. This new civilization that comes and settles is meant to be permanent. And in order to be permanent, you have to dehumanize what has been there before and eliminate it in such a way that no one can actually equal one and the other. And in that process, there are destructive modes, because we're talking about exterminating, extincting, and dispossessing the native people in order to reach land appropriation. And so some have called actually the consequences very much genocidal. It's a genocidal process because you eliminate the culture and the people and the bodies of these previous people. And in that way, the lawyer that actually coined the term genocide, the one that we use now at the United Nations, and the word genocide whenever it is used, it actually has an axis of different terminologies. It's not only about destroying or crippling the subjugated people in their development, but it also gives occupying power the position of numerical, physical, and economic superiority. That is also a genocide. Whenever you give a power in numbers, in physical and in economic superiority, you are talking about the genocide of the indigenous population. And so in this way, the new techniques of occupation aimed at winning the peace, even though the war itself is lost, is a genocide. It's a practice of extermination of nations and ethnic groups that is effected through a synchronized attack on different aspects of life of the captive people in the realms of politics, society, culture, economics, biology, physical existence, which includes starvation and killing, religion, and morality. So it's not all of them together. Whenever you touch upon one of these, you can already talk about a genocide of the people. And so these legal terms are very important to master and understand whenever you want to talk about settler colonialism, because it needs to break down all of these elements to subjugate the occupied population. In my research, I'm particularly interested in starvation as a technique of exterminating within settler colonialism. And the reason why I look at starvation, because it's the cheapest way to control and weaken bodies. You don't need a lot to starve people, and you can gain a lot from it. And when you look at history, and in my case, I've looked into Canada, you can see that in the way what is called the dominant, which is the British and the French when they conquered Canada, in their way of capturing the Canadian plains and going, expanding the lands, they have used extra attention, they have paid extra attention to the use of hunger in order to clear the West. According to Canadian researchers, the land was prepared for settlement by government officials before the flood of immigrants. So before they started sending people in ships to Canada, they were already starving the indigenous Indian population for years. And they withheld the food from the people until they pushed them to move into small reservations appointed for them, forcing them to trade their freedom for rations. And if you can understand what this sentence means, it is not easy to see it happening in the Gaza Strip. And so what they have done is actually demonstrating that food has a significant historical significance as a weapon of attempted ethnocide and its lasting impact on indigenous subjugation. And hence, what also settler colonialism explained and showed us, whether in the States or in Canada or Australia, you cannot exterminate all the indigenous people. Not all of them are gone. Many are still remaining. But then you need to change your tactics in order to exterminate them. And what we see today, what is Canada doing, what is Australia is actually doing, is that they use unsafe drinking water and terrible housing conditions as a norm in the reservations for the Indians. They deprive them from hygiene kits. They deprive them from sewage. They deprive them from water facilitation, food. They even ration their food. They deprive them from proper education. And something that they also do, especially in Canada, and this is up until the 60s, is they took all the kids, children, all newborns from a certain period of time, took them away from their parents in order to take the next generations of native and put them into Canadian schools in order to make them assimilate to the extent that the only way that will remain from their exterior as native people will be only their hair, the way they looked. But everything else had to be pushed into becoming Canadian. And so they deprived parents from children in order to exterminate the next generation and assimilate them, which is a huge violation, of course, of human rights, but it only shows that settler colonialism, with time, looks at new mechanisms in order to gain the land. It works on actually appropriating land. And so these politics of rationing their food and their water and their hygiene and all of this are politics of starvation that are continuous through time. And it allows us to understand the persistence of colonialism through space and time. What I try to research is actually to look at how can you institutionalize starvation as a mode of land appropriation. How do you create a mechanism that can deprive millions of people of food in order to gain land from them? How do you kill them slowly? How do you subjugate them? And this is how I've been looking into it. And if you look at the early 21st century Israeli legislation, you will see that they have transformed the Palestinian cause into a humanitarian need of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip as a way to turn it into something that is only about food and only about water and only about sewage and not anymore about demands of a people for self-determination. And these mechanisms have also been used in Canada and the United States. And what is very important to know is learn how this mechanism works to understand that lots of Palestinians think that we are a very special case, that it all evolves around us and no one is going through what we have been going through before. Much of it is true because in the 21st century we're the only colonized people on this planet, but the tools and the mechanisms that are being used are very much coming from the same motherland that implemented them 200 years ago. It's just evolving with time, and so it's very important to understand that. Just to give you an example of what the British did with the Canadians is actually that at some point they wanted to expand the territory and gain more land and exterminate the natives, and what they did is they pushed them and kept pushing them because the natives, of course, were more in numbers. The British were more in weapons and they were just military stronger, but the natives were more in numbers. And in order to create an equation, they pushed them and they actually blocked them between two rivers. So they pushed the natives and certain tribes and ambushed them between two rivers. And then from nature, was already ambushing them, and they blocked them from the two other sides. So you had British watchtowers and army on this side, and on this side, the natives were in the middle, and they were trapped between two rivers. And it was to that extent at that time that they kept starving them to the extent that the tribe was consistent of 10,000 people. Only 100 people remained alive. And all they needed was actually to gain food. People were eating not only their horses and everything, and they ate the grass on the ground and kept eating in order to survive, but they kept starving them to the extent that the head of the tribe who survived kept crawling to reach the head of the British Army to sign a treaty and say, we will go into a reservation, the land is yours. And when he reached and signed, he died from actually a weakened body. And all of this is documented. It's archived that has been made available by Canada recently. This is why settler colonialism is a new field. It's because these kind of archives are not allowed to be published in such a way by the United States and Canada and Britain, because it's not the kind of documents that they would like to have coming outside. And so these are just small examples. In the case of the Gaza Strip, I try to make a comparison between these kind of mechanisms and how Israel is a settler, which kind of settler colonial techniques Israel is using specifically when it comes to starvation. And so it's easy to see on the ground that the size of historical Palestine has been expansionally shrinking in favor of the expansionist endeavors of the State of Israel. And so the land, Palestine has been shrinking. They have gained more land. And as researchers such as Wolf that are very much concerned with settler colonialism claim is that it's a project that feeds on land appropriation and strives for the dissolution of native societies. So a new colonial society is erected on the expropriated land base, and hence settler colonizers are coming to stay. They're not going anywhere. And this is also very important to understand, is that invasion is a structure, it's not an event. Americans are not going anywhere. They're Europeans. They're not going anywhere. Canadians are not going anywhere. Israelis will not go anywhere. we need to understand that in order to see how we can progress in resolving this situation. Because when we have in our, like, whenever you talk, people say, okay, what is the solution that you have in mind? One state solution. What does that mean? How do you perceive it? What are you going to do with Israeli citizens? Where are they going? Right of return and all of that. In that way, you need to look at other settler colonial societies and understand, look at history. None of the settlers is going back home or have gone back home. They're all here. And so in that way, we need to understand what that means for Palestine. And so whenever they invade a country to settle on it, there's a mechanism behind it coming from the motherland that has already attributed an entire administration to first invade, 2, take the land, 1, subjugate the population, 3, have settlers come and settle, create an economy that has to go very fast in order to settle these settlers. They need to have economic benefits in order to migrate from their motherland to the new land. And so there's an entire mechanism in it, and that mechanism is being set in motion way before the settlers arrive. And it's very easy to see it in the state of Israel. You can see that whenever new migrants arrive, whether for France, like last week, this year, for instance, this is the first time in 10 years that there's a height in the number of of new migrants to the state of Israel. When these people arrive, everything is settled for them and arranged economically. They have benefits, they have schools waiting for them, they have an entire system that is put in motion for them. And so whenever they come, they have to find something that is better for them than the place they have left. And the administration that is taking care of that is aware of it. I think we should also be aware of that in our struggle, in the way we look at this situation. So when it comes to the Gaza Strip, and when we have this entire background in mind, I claim that Israel's land appropriation regarding the Gaza Strip, for Israel, Gaza is all about land. So if it's up to Israel, they would get rid of the 2 million people and claim the land. Let that be clear. So it's, even if they claim to have disengaged, they have not. They have just changed the mode and techniques of occupying this small piece of land. And so I say that their way of appropriating the land has been a process that was set in motion almost 30 years ago. The first one was mapping the land that they were going to isolate and mapping it in a way that has to be spatial, to actually isolate it from the rest of what they call Israel or historical Palestine. When you start isolating it, you can then enter a second phase, which is actually retrieving the non-indigenous settlers that are there in order to create a racialized space that could be confined in order to annex it fastly. And so what you do is you mark the place. This is the territory. You retrieve everything that is not Palestinian from it. So you retrieve your own settlements, you retrieve your own people, you retrieve everything that can stop them from bombing. If the settlers would still be in the Gaza Strip, they would never have bombed the Gaza Strip the way they have done in the past 3 wars. And so whenever you create this racialized space, then you can have violence with impunity, because then you can bomb any place without hurting your own people. And finally, you enter in a third and final space, which actually consists of the colonizer control over the natives' bodies, starving the native population into subjugation, as starvation is an internal part of 19th century settler strategies of domination. And I can go into details of these 3 phases and how they have been set in motion, and how Israel has actually done this first phase of isolating the Gaza Strip. It actually started with the Oslo Accords. And so with the signature of the Oslo Accords in the 90s, there was already a general closure of the Gaza Strip being implemented as the peace agreements were actually taking place, the Gaza Strip were being completely sealed off through what Israel calls a total closure of the Gaza Strip, a policy of closure that discriminates along ethnic lines. Israel, after that, in 1993, as Oslo was being signed, it imposed a permit system on Palestinians to move within the borders of historical Palestine. Hence, any Palestinian wanting to enter Israel or travel between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank had to apply already back in 1993 for a permit, because this was happening simultaneously as the Oslo Accords were being negotiated and signed, which were actually promising Palestinians a state. And so it shows that as a settler colonial entity, you are always striving for more and more land. And it evolved. It started with a closure, and then it got a permit system in 1995 as the Oslo agreements had to be implemented, which means, the retrieval of Israelis and giving the land. The military, Israeli military, actually redeployed in the Gaza Strip in 1995, setting in motion the full isolation of the Gaza Strip with a perimeter fence encircling the Gaza Strip and separating it from Israel. The fence that is now around the entire Gaza Strip has been built in 1995 as Oslo was being implemented. And so at that time already there was a separation barrier which run across the Green Line, consisting of electronic fences and patrol roads and all kinds of security and buffer zones, all of them reaching up to 1 kilometer of Palestinian land, eating up agricultural land. So look at 1995 and how much land they've already appropriated from the Gaza Strip, and how that evolved today into more and more land with what they claim to be buffer zones in agricultural land and all kinds of isolation. But this demarcation of land was not just spatial. It has also a very important component, and that was an economic isolation to influence Palestinian economic development in virtually every single aspect. All of it is actually in the 90s. With the signature of the Oslo Accord, there was something called and set in motion, which is a total business management of the Gaza Strip, making it completely and so they started fencing up and putting a fence and isolating the Gaza Strip. And after doing that, or simultaneously, they isolated the Gaza Strip completely economically, making every single thing from trade, import and export, employment, dispersal of tax revenues, travel and business management, all of them were linked to the Israeli bureaucracy, which gradually erased domestic private investment from the Gaza Strip. Additionally, Israel's continuous military action prevented any emergence of semi-functional economic structures. By 1995, 65% of Gaza's population lived under poverty line, with an unemployment rate of 35% of the workforce. Due to all these restrictions, self-sustainment in the Gaza Strip was hardly feasible already 30 years ago. Systematic policies of expropriation and disinstitutionalization destabilized the economy, social, political, and geographical fabric of the Palestinian society in the Gaza Strip. It was only after establishing a firm level of deterioration, intractable economic depression, and de-development that Israel retrieved its settlers and all settlement infrastructure from the Gaza Strip in 2005. So what they did is basically isolate, fence, put barriers, isolate more, break down the economy to the extent that there was no way that Gaza Strip could be sustainable on its own. And when that process that took 10 years, from 1995 to 2005, was fulfilled, Only then the disengagement plan was put in motion and settlers were removed. Once you remove the settlers and you enter in the second phase, which is actually besieging the Gaza Strip, the election and all of that they claim that are the real reason behind, sieging the Gaza Strip or imposing it are just a farce. It is actually a much more evolved mechanism that is behind all of this. And so when the first phase was ended, the second one could start, and that second phase is actually removing and retrieving anything that is non-Palestinian from the Gaza Strip. And so in 2005, the Gaza Strip population consisted of 1.4 million Palestinians and almost 8,000 Israeli settlers that have been living there for 38 years. The settlers were living in 21 Jewish-only settlements spread all over the Gaza Strip, interconnected with Jewish-only roads that would actually connect them and bring them back and forth to the State of Israel. In order to safeguard their security, a variety of surveillance mechanisms such as roadblocks and checkpoints were set up, and everything up until 15% of the Gaza Strip was allocated for the use of these settlers. And hence, when the second phase has to be in motion, the settlers were actually retrieved as land appropriation is the element around which to construct this entire mechanism in order to create a racialized space that could be policing and taming properly the indigenous population into subjugation. Any non-indigenous element had to be removed. Israel might have withdrawn in 2005, but the process was already set in motion way before that. The aims of this unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip were about increasing the security of the residents of Israel, and hence, whenever they retrieved all of the settlers, it was to the extent that they also evacuated all of the dead bodies in Jewish cemeteries. And so, you need to retrieve anything that is non-indigenous from that piece of land that you want to conquer and subjugate the natives in it. Because if you have one Israeli in that land, you will not attack the population to safeguard the safety of that Israeli. And so when they retrieved the settlers, they even evacuated 48 graves, which is actually in violation of Jewish laws. There is, just as in Islam, I think you cannot just retrieve bodies from the ground to relocate them in another place. Rabbis had to be brought together from the State of Israel to give them some kind of fatwa, to tell them, yes, you can take away the bodies of the Israelis and move them into the State of Israel. And they did this. And so sealing off the Gaza Strip and announcing it will remain control over space and air and space and sea and borders of the Gaza Strip, including the borders with Egypt, only proved actually that there was a complete disconnection of the Gaza Strip with the rest of Palestine and disconnecting it actually from the Palestinian body. And in order to create a fragmentation of land and population into small, narrow strips, Israel was actually incarcerating the population and policing the natives as part of 19th century colonization techniques. At this stage, in 2005, the World Bank described the Gaza Strip's economy as the worst economic depression in modern history. This is in 2005. And so, look at us 10 years later. Where are we from what is happening and these kind of plans? And so, after taking out the indigenous population and after blockading and breaking down the economy and imposing less than a year later a full blockade on the Gaza Strip as a collective punishment of the natives' choice for the way they choose to be governed. On September 2007, the Israeli Ministerial National Security Committee designated Gaza as a hostile territory and decided to impose sanctions in order to restrict the passage of various goods to the Gaza Strip and reduce the supply of fuel and electricity, and impose restrictions upon the movement of persons to and from the Gaza Strip, and reduce the amount of food and nutrition that would be to enter the Gaza Strip. The flow of resources and goods that would enter the Strip was only the necessary amount to keep an entire population close to the minimum limit of physical existence. And this has been a policy that has been approved by the Knesset and has been imposed in a document called the Red Lines documents that for 2 years on a row would actually calculate the amount of calories needed to the minimum amount of calories that a population in the Gaza Strip, or a man and a woman and a child and an infant, needs in order not to die. And so what you do is you actually create weak, fragile bodies in order to push them into whatever you want. Remember the native Indian who actually was starving to death and had to sign a treaty? It's the same idea. Starve the bodies to sign a treaty, whether it's a ceasefire or an agreement or a peace process or whatever you want to call it. It's the same mechanism. I'm almost through my time, so just to give you to make you understand that you need to dehumanize the native in order to create a colonial racial identification, and you make a distinction between the colonized and the colonizer. The last phase of Israel's actually killing of the Gaza Strip is a systematic devastation of the means of living a modern urban life, which is almost impossible in the Gaza Strip. They have been breaking down all kinds of structures in order to oppress any form of indigenous revolt. And so by breaking down all these structures, what you want to reach is actually any kind of revolt from the people against those that occupy them. And one of the cheapest and effective ways, of course, is actually through food as a weapon of war, a mean of control directed on the surveillance of every aspect of Palestinian life. And so, just to conclude, when we started to talk about settler colonialism, I said that the premise on what it survives is actually land appropriation. So what is the land that they want from the Gaza Strip? It is not only the land that they have confiscated as a border fence, first of all. Then they have called a buffer zone. And then on top of the buffer zone that grows exponentially, you go from a 300-meter line, and then you add another kilometer to it, and then you add another 300 meters. So you're already at 40% of the Gaza Strip agricultural land being actually annexed as some kind of buffer zone. They do the same thing in the waters of the Gaza Strip, going from 20 nautical miles up to 3 nautical miles. That is also gaining actually land appropriation. But what is most actually dangerous is that they are not only after the land of the Gaza Strip, which is the land where these people are located, but 80% of the population in the Gaza Strip is refugee. It means that these people have land outside of the Gaza Strip in the state of Israel. And there is a UN resolution that gives them the right to go back to these lands. And that is what scares Israel like hell. Because if these people are not subjugating into oppression and giving up their rights and giving up their rights of return, one day they will claim land that has already been given to Israel. And so it's not only about this 40 kilometers that is the Gaza Strip, but it's about the bigger land problem when it comes to Palestinian Israelis. And this is why settler colonialism is very important to understand as a mechanism when we talk about Israel-Palestine.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanine. If you have comments and questions, don't hesitate to ask.
I'm sorry it took so long, but it's a very...
It's very interesting. Do you have questions? Comments?
Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
Noam Chomsky says, we, means Americans, rationalized ethnic cleansing in Palestine because we did it first. When I was in the U.S. last year, I have noticed that like some shops and buildings and things named after like Colonial something, and I feel like some Americans are still proud of their colonial history. How do you see like a connection between this persistent culture and the rationalization of ethnic cleansing, including starvation and other forms of ethnic cleansing in Palestine?
The thing about what has happened in the United States is very specific on its own because it has really succeeded in containing the indigenous native population in a way that they don't dare anymore to come up front. But I think Israel's biggest problem is that it has failed in exterminating a big chunk of the population. And that is why when we talk about ethnic cleansing, yes, when you push people out of the border, that is also ethnic cleansing. When we talk about 6 million Palestinian refugees that have a right to go back, that is Israel's biggest fear. And this is why we have to understand that this is really about demographic numbers and about land. The Americans today, as I said, settlers are not going anywhere. There is no way you can tell an American today after 200 years, you should go back to Ireland actually, or you should go back to France, or you should go back to Italy, because that's basically where they came from. Because when you start this conversation with Americans and you tell an Irish person to go back home, you'll have to use that same dialogue with the African Americans that were actually brought as slaves in the country. So it's a very complex situation. And of course one doesn't equal the other, because even African Americans were brought against their will to the lands, to the United States, but their history has been completely blocked from them. None of them know where they come from originally. In contrary with white Americans, which know exactly where they come from, where their roots are, because it's kept in a tradition of being proud, like my parents came from that place or my parents. And why go far? I mean, New York is called New York, it used to be New Amsterdam, because the Dutch were the ones that discovered it. Although no one discovered America, because America was already discovered by its own people. But it's this white mentality of thinking that we discover places and hence we get the right to name them, to give them a name, as you mentioned, and all that. So America was not discovered, people were already living there. So it's very unjust, but you cannot undo that mechanism. Just as it will be very hard to undo it in Palestine. We cannot undo ethnic cleansing, but we have to look at how to deal with it.
I have a comment. Just now when you were talking about the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in the year 2005, I think it was a studied step because Israel knew earlier that the Palestinians will live in conflict as long as they withdraw from the Gaza Strip. And this is what happens actually at the moment. The Palestinians already fought, and we are living in this separation between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and this is a second colonization that we are living under as Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and even the people who already live in the West Bank. Do you agree or disagree?
I mean that we are aware of what Israel is doing?
I mean that when Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip, they knew that the Palestinians will fight with each other, and they will be away from thinking of returning back to the land of 1967 or even 48.
I mean, I can tell you something. Sure, we talk about colonialism, settler colonialism, in terms of they have a project and they're implementing it. But we also, as natives or as the population, have also a say in this. I mean, Israel thought really that after the first war they were done with any kind of resistance in the Gaza Strip, because the population would literally turn against any kind of resistance.
Because of our narrow mentality.
Or because no one wants to die alive. Because of a human nature in every human being that if I'm alive I want to have a dignified life. But having a separation between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and Palestinian fractions not being able to collaborate or to coexist, we can undo this, even if Israel.
So how can we undo it?
Well, by having sessions among one another and by teaching the young people in this strip, let's not go for as the West Bank, but in this strip to coexist, to simply say, regardless of your background, regardless of your political color or your affiliation, I am willing to listen to what you have to say. It's you know, it's not a fantasy. It's actually a must. It's something that has to happen for the sake of a project that we would like to establish. Today in the Gaza Strip, every single person here has family in the West Bank and has family in 48. So we are a nation. We're just separated. But somehow, you know, due to pressures, due to affiliations, due to colors, we're not able to sit together and find a common solution. And so I don't think it's impossible. Yes, Israel is playing a role. Not only Israel, the entire world is playing a role in this. But we're not.
The catastrophe is that we know that the entire world is playing a major role in this separation, and we are insisting on living in this situation. I'm not talking about us, the population, but I do talk about the leaders, and we are blamed as population because we do nothing for ending the separation.
That's true. I mean, that is true. I mean, this is a dialogue that should be taken into actions, especially as you know, new youth generations that come. You guys are different than the ones before you. You know, I mean, you are as a generation different than the one before you. Your experience as a generation, your generation has seen wars, while the previous generations were only dealing with intifadas, which is
Unproportionate.
you know, I mean, you really need to take that kind of experiences that you have as a citizen and try to find ways. I know it sounds like a fantasy or something that is hard to do, but personally,
This is a planned project. This is a planned project by the organization.
well, I really think that, you know, if Israel is not able to subjugate the people, even though they're trying so hard and putting so much money in it, that means that these people are really willing to live. What does Israel want from the Gaza Strip? Just to give up, just to raise a white flag and say, that's it, Akka, it's yours. This is, and they'll let you live. They'll put a seaport, they'll let you come in out once a month, you know, like they do in a zoo with animals. That's what Israel is willing to do if you give up.
And this is what actually happened.
You're not
Now
yet.
now we are willing only to see the border opens for once a week or twice a week.
Yeah, but don't underestimate
This
the
is
kind
all
of
ambitious.
pressure you've been under. I mean, if this was another population, look at like the neighboring Arab countries. They've been going through this for 4 years and they're going crazy. Like, they don't know what's happening to them. After 4 years, they're losing it completely, not being able to function normally, not being able to be productive, effective. Palestinians have been going through this for 70 years. So let's really not underestimate the kind of power that Palestinians have in going through this, in coping with this. At the same time, it's not time yet to give up. You know, it's not time yet because internationally there's also a shift in how the world is looking at Israel. And so we need to kind of find a way out.
Inshallah, someday, somehow.
Inshallah.
Yeah.
I have a question. There's a couple of things. You said that there is no other country that is under occupation. There are actually, there's several. West Papua being one, which is under occupation by Indonesia. And there's histories of countries that have, which like East Timor, for instance, got rid of the Indonesians. They had to leave. Another similar struggle is Kanaki, or New Caledonia as it's known, where the French. I mean, there are examples where settler colonisers have been expelled, so it's not impossible. And I think the difference between somewhere like the United States, where it's hundreds of years, and where the Israeli settlers, they're still arriving. You know, you actually can stop them, and they have dual citizenship. So they have got somewhere else to go. Whereas descendants of Ireland they don't even have an Irish passport. They're 10th, 6th, 7th generation, whatever. You know, they only have one citizenship, so they can't return. It's not, you know, it's not the issue. Well, I know that I'm a New Zealander who has, my families came from various, England, you know, those countries. I cannot go to England. I have no right. I can't even work in England. And yet I'm from a so-called British family, 5 generations or 6 generations ago. I'm just like you. I have to get a visa. I don't have to get a visa, but I can't work there, and I can only stay for a short period, and I have to show that I've got the money to even get in there, because otherwise they just kick you out again because they don't believe that you leave. So things like, that's another issue. But I think the issue of starvation, having lived in several countries in Latin America and in Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, colonised countries, there are a variety of ways. I think that, like you're right about Australia, they were rounded up into reservations, whereas in New Zealand they had a treaty with the indigenous people. And I must tell you all, don't use the word native, because that's quite a derogatory term. We call them indigenous people. They are indigenous to the land. Native is an insulting term that white colonisers used about the black people. It's an insulting term. So we always say indigenous people, not native people. But one of the issues is the ways in which people, I think that this notion, it's quite an interesting one of using starvation as a tool, but it doesn't really, it assumes that those people, weren't they eaten before the colonisers arrived? I mean, they, for instance, the Aboriginal people in Australia had been there for 4,000 or 40,000 years. They certainly knew how to eat and live in the desert. They didn't go to a shop and buy their food. They were hunter-gatherers, you know, and it's kind of disingenuous to suggest that that starvation was used against them, because it wasn't. They had the survival skills, and the same as Maori in New Zealand and all the indigenous peoples that I've ever lived with, or grow their corn, grow their beans, and they're still doing it in Latin American countries, the Zapatistas, for instance. And it's kind of like here in the Gaza Strip, you've got farmlands, why don't you grow your own food? It's not like you haven't got the land to grow it, and to be self-sufficient. It's kind of like, I think it's more that there's been a culture, an UNRWA, like this is the whole UN influence, it's a culture of dependency that has been developed rather than a policy of starvation. And people have become aid dependent and disempowered in terms of fulfilling their own needs, which when you go to other places, the people are much more empowered as part of their political empowerment. It's also, they grow their own food. For instance, the Zapatistas grow their corn and grow their beans. There's no UNRWA to feed them. If they don't grow their beans and their corn, they die. Simple as that. There's no UNRWA giving them a bag of rice, you know. So it has a whole other...
Thank you.
I'll just answer with 2 points.
Sorry, I just want to ask a question. It might answer her first part. Is your study is limited to the Western world, or can it be applied universally?
Settler colonialism is really, as a study, like as an department where I'm at, we look mostly to the Western world. So we look at Canada and Australia and the United States. Settlement has been happening all over since ancient history. People have been moving from one place to the other. But we do look at it from the beginning of modern times, which is, let's say, when modernity started approximately. We look at it in the past 400 years, up to 500 years ago, up until today. Just to answer your first question regarding settlers, maybe when it comes to the example you mentioned, that you as a New Zealander could not go to England because you are no longer British, or you don't know where your ancestors are, you don't have a passport, etc. And in contrary to Israelis, that all of them are dual passport holders and get to go and move whenever they can. So it is a process that can be done. I'll have to disagree on this one, because when it comes to Israelis, that same line of not having a dual passport anymore is being applied to those living in the state of Israel as a first-generation migrants that left after World War I. Actually, the migration started way before the Holocaust. So Israelis or settlers started to settle in Palestine as early as the late 18th century. So settlers of that time, there are still Israeli citizens today, are third and fourth generations of Israelis in the state of Israel, who today claim of no longer knowing where they come from. And they do apply the same techniques as Americans and New Zealanders and Australians do by saying, my ancestors are Irish, but I am an Israeli citizen. I was born and raised in Israel. My dad was born and raised in Israel, so was his granddad. So there is a segment of the Israeli population that has been living there for 3 and 4 generations.
Small, very small.
Nonetheless, these are settlers, and whether small, I mean, the entire Israeli population is 5 million. You can say that's a relatively small number of people. But the facts are, a segment of these people have been there for 3 and 4 generations. International law looks at them in this way as, people that have settled there and will be stateless should they be removed from that piece of land, just as you would be stateless if I would remove you from New Zealand because you don't have any other kind of legal document. And so when we look at this, we entered into this legal side of managing the problem. The second point, when it comes to starvation, you say, yes, but they have been there for I don't know how long, and they have been managing themselves and leading and eating and hunting and fishing and self-sustaining. Indeed, they were. None of these natives or indigenous people have ever needed the settlers in order to survive or live or exist. They have only needed them or needed their rations just as we need the UNRWA in the Gaza Strip, when actually the flow of food has been prohibited from entering. That's when you become a dependent, when the kind of food and sustainability and economy that you need to sustain yourself is actually being broken, as Israel has been doing in the Gaza Strip. Way before the settlers came, there was never a UNRWA in Palestine needed to feed the Palestinians. Palestine was self-sustainable, economy was full and thriving. Jaffa was exporting oranges all over the world, and name it, there was an economy that was one of the strongest economies in the Middle East, in the region. That was broken down. That has been really meticulously, in a very precise way, broken down in order to make these people a dependent. And today, the agricultural land that you need in the Gaza Strip to sustain yourself is being appropriated as a buffer zone. The entire border line is the agricultural land. See if a farmer can access it. He loses his knees. He's being shot at. If he wants to access it, he'll need the protection of a UN car or a foreign car or name it. It's just making so many obstacles for you to reach that area to sustain yourself. Additionally, Israel is spraying chemicals on agricultural land to actually prevent the kind of food to enter, the kind of food to be grown in these lands. So starvation is a technique to subjugate people. People never needed to be starved to survive before the arrival of the settlers. It's just a mechanism that you use. You just put people, corner them, ambush them, and then starve them, in the hope that you'll be that hungry and fragile and weak that you will tell the one that is occupying you, fine, I surrender. What are your demands? Which treaty do I need to sign in order to give you my land? Just as they did in New Zealand. You call it a treaty, but it's not. It's actually an illegal piece of document that has been forced upon a population by another population to create some kind of...
No, it wasn't. It wasn't a treaty that was forced, and it's actually honoured, and there's a whole, that's another whole thing, because there's been a big thing where most of the lands, the Treaty of Waitangi is the founding document of New Zealand, and it gives certain rights to the British and certain rights to the indigenous people.
Do you think the British are entitled to rights in a land that is not theirs?
The chiefs agreed to certain things.
Why did
they? No, not because they wanted the advantages. It was a double, we will get advantages from you and you know, it was a give and take. And because the indigenous people...
They are entitled to a piece of land that is not theirs as invaders to a country.
No, they are entitled. It's like you are entitled to sell your house if you choose to.
Yeah, but you're a settler.
And that's your choice. You can choose to sell it or not to sell it.
No, I mean, you're a foreign
They enforce
invader.
your choice.
No, because this is the difference, and this is a big difference between the New Zealand Treaty and any other colonised country. Because this treaty did, in fact, give the indigenous people a lot of rights, and there's just been a huge process which is just wrapping up now of returning all of the dispossessed lands, the dispossessed forests, the fisheries. All of the New Zealand fisheries have been returned to Maori hands. They are all back in Maori hands. No white person can just go fishing out there. They have to get a license from Maori people.
But just a
You know,
question.
this is
I just want to just make a point that you have a foreigner, which is a British person, that comes to a land that is not his, in the name of the Queen, settles in New Zealand, and then gives the indigenous people a treaty telling them we have equal rights.
No, the treaty was after a lot of wars, battles.
Indeed, there were wars.
Yes,
An invader came to somebody else's land.
But the indigenous people were themselves invaders. There was somebody else there before them, and they killed them, and they got rid of them. So, this is the history of my country. One, we had the Moriori, then we had the Maori, then we had, like in Gaza, you've had a lot of different people.
One last word, and then we conclude.
Sure. Oh.
Okay, you want to conclude?
No, I've had these conversations a lot. It's always very hard for the new settlers to acknowledge the kind of, let me just put it this way. Before the arrival of a settler in Palestine, who claims to want to give me basic and equal rights, I had rights. I do not need a peace agreement to give me these rights from an invader that is coming from a foreign country and claiming to be superior because of his background. This is the case of Israel.
Well, do you understand that a treaty is an agreement between two equal partners? That's what a treaty is. A country, Palestine signs a treaty with another country. Sovereign, self-determining people enter agreements.
Legally binding, such as the treaties that Canada has signed with the indigenous people. Treaty number 6, for instance, which deprived the Canadians from the indigenous population from their land. None of these treaties, if you would look at them today through our legislation, none of them are legally binding, because a treaty has to take place between two sovereign entities.
And it did. It did take place between sovereign entities. The New Zealand sovereign entity and the British sovereign. And that's why the New Zealand Treaty does have recognition in both New Zealand, or it's considered the founding document of the country. And the indigenous people are today's indigenous people.
Okay.
Refer to the treaty.
Okay.
It's in all of
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Hanine, for your presentation. Thank you all for coming today, and I hope to see you very soon in another talk, another lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you.